The Kansas winter had settled into Abigail's valley with the kind of cold that made every breath visible and turned the ground hard as iron beneath a blanket of fresh snow. At 18, she had spent 3 years alone in the homestead her parents built, managing survival through careful rationing of preserved foods, maintaining the woodpile that kept her small cabin warm, and avoiding the attention of travelers who occasionally passed through seeking shelter or supplies. She had learned that being a young woman alone in frontier territory meant cultivating invisibility, helping when necessary but never inviting prolonged interaction, maintaining polite distance from everyone, and trusting no one completely. The wagon arrived just before sunset, on a day when the temperature had been dropping steadily since morning, promising a brutal night ahead. Abigail watched from her window as 2 rough-looking men guided their horses toward her property, pulling a covered wagon that creaked ominously with each rotation of its wheels. She recognized the type immediately: bounty hunters or traders in human cargo, the kind of men who profited from conflict by capturing tribal peoples and selling them to military authorities, or worse. Her father had despised such men, calling them vultures who fed on suffering, and Abigail had inherited his contempt, even as she understood the necessity of appearing cooperative when they stopped at her isolated homestead. The lead man, a heavy-set individual with a thick beard matted with ice, knocked on her door with the casual authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He explained they needed to stable their horses in her barn overnight, that the cold was too severe to continue traveling, and that they would pay for the accommodation if she could also provide hot food. His tone suggested the request was actually a demand, and Abigail agreed quickly, knowing that resistance would invite problems far worse than their temporary presence. She prepared a simple meal while the men tended their horses, and she tried not to think about what or who might be in that covered wagon. After the bounty hunters ate and retired to sleep in her barn, where it was warmer than outside but colder than her cabin, Abigail found herself unable to rest. Something about the wagon haunted her, a sense of wrongness that grew stronger as the night deepened, and wind howled through the valley carrying snow that would soon make travel impossible until the storm passed. Around midnight, driven by conscience she could not quiet, Abigail wrapped herself in her warmest coat and crept out to the barn, moving silently through snow that muffled her footsteps. The bounty hunters were snoring loudly, warmed by whiskey they had consumed after dinner, and confident that no one would disturb them in this remote location. Abigail approached the wagon carefully, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would wake them, despite the noise of their drunken sleep. She lifted the canvas covering slightly and nearly gasped at what she saw. A Lakota warrior lay bound and gagged in the wagon bed, his face bruised and his body showing signs of severe mistreatment. His eyes opened when light from her lantern fell across his face, and she saw in them not the hostility she had been taught to expect, but rather pain, exhaustion, and a kind of resigned acceptance that made her chest tighten with unwanted emotion. Abigail stood frozen for a long moment, weighing the terrible choice before her. Every practical consideration screamed that she should close the canvas, return to her cabin, and pretend she had seen nothing. Getting involved would bring consequences she could scarcely imagine: the bounty hunter's rage, potential legal prosecution for freeing a prisoner, danger to her own survival in a valley where she already lived precariously at the edge of sustainability. Yet as she looked at the bound warrior, she heard her father's voice in memory speaking words he had often repeated. That character was measured not by comfortable choices, but by what you did when doing right, carried a cost you could barely afford to pay. She made her decision quickly, before rational thought could override conscience. Using a knife she had brought, Abigail cut through the ropes binding the warrior's hands and feet, then carefully removed the gag from his mouth. He stared at her with obvious confusion, perhaps suspecting a trap or unable to comprehend why this white woman would risk herself to free him. Abigail gestured urgently toward the barn door, indicating he needed to leave immediately and silently. She pressed into his hands a bundle she had hastily prepared: dried meat, bread, a blanket, and a water skin, supplies she could ill afford to lose, but which might mean the difference between his survival and death in the frozen wilderness. The warrior, later she would learn his name was Hinto, meaning blue, hesitated only briefly before accepting her gift. He spoke no words, perhaps because he lacked English or perhaps because he understood that silence was essential. Instead, he placed his hand briefly over his heart in a gesture that seemed to communicate gratitude more eloquently than any language could have conveyed. Then he slipped from the wagon and disappeared into the snowy darkness, moving with surprising stealth despite his injuries and weakened condition. Abigail watched him vanish, then carefully recovered the wagon and returned to her cabin, her hands shaking from cold and reaction to what she had just done. She lay awake the rest of that night, listening to wind and wondering when the bounty hunters would discover their prisoner's escape, trying to prepare herself mentally for the confrontation that would surely come at dawn. But when morning arrived and the men emerged from the barn, they seemed more concerned with the storm that had intensified overnight than with checking their cargo. They ate a quick breakfast Abigail provided, paid her as promised, and departed hastily, apparently eager to reach their destination before weather made travel completely impossible. It was only after they were miles away that they would discover the empty wagon, and by then Hinto would have had hours of head start into terrain where tracking would be nearly impossible in the heavy snow. Abigail allowed herself a moment of relief, believing perhaps that her act of mercy would have no further consequences beyond the supplies she had sacrificed. But as she went about her daily tasks, maintaining the cabin and caring for her small livestock, she could not shake a growing sense of unease. The valley felt different somehow, as if her secret action had disturbed some delicate balance she had not fully understood. She tried to dismiss the feeling as imagination and exhaustion from her sleepless night, but deep down she sensed that something had changed irrevocably, that consequences were already in motion, even if she could not yet perceive their shape. 3 days passed in deceptive calm after the bounty hunter's departure. The storm cleared, leaving the valley buried under deep snow that transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. Abigail maintained her routines, feeding her chickens and single-milk cow, chopping wood to replenish her depleted supply, melting snow for water since her well had frozen solid. The physical labor helped quiet her mind's constant replay of the night she had freed Hinto, though she found herself frequently scanning the horizon for signs of riders returning to question her or worse. On the 4th day, she received her first visitor since the bounty hunters, a traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas, who occasionally passed through the valley offering religious services to isolated homesteaders. He was a gaunt man in his 50s, who seemed driven by genuine if somewhat rigid faith, and Abigail had always treated him with polite hospitality, despite her own ambivalent relationship with organized religion. This visit, however, felt different from his previous stops. Reverend Thomas seemed agitated, his usual calm demeanor replaced by nervous energy that set Abigail immediately on edge. Over coffee in her cabin, the preacher explained that he had encountered troubling signs during his travels through the region. Tensions between military authorities and tribal groups had escalated dramatically in recent weeks, with several violent incidents creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. More concerning, he had heard rumors that bounty hunters were claiming someone in this valley had freed a valuable prisoner, and that groups of armed men were forming to search for anyone sympathizing with or aiding tribal peoples they considered enemies. The preacher warned Abigail that simply being alone and isolated made her vulnerable to suspicion, that angry men looking for scapegoats were not overly concerned with evidence or fairness. Abigail felt her blood run cold as she listened to his warning, realizing that her act of mercy had indeed triggered consequences she had not fully anticipated. She maintained careful neutrality as she responded to the preacher, neither confirming nor denying any knowledge of escaped prisoners, simply expressing concern about the deteriorating situation and asking what she should do to protect herself. Reverend Thomas recommended that she consider temporarily leaving the valley, perhaps staying with other homesteaders, or even relocating to a proper town until tensions subsided. Remaining alone in such volatile circumstances was dangerous, especially for a young woman without family or community protection. After the preacher departed, continuing his circuit with promises to pray for her safety, Abigail spent hours wrestling with his advice. Leaving meant abandoning the homestead her parents had built, the only home she had ever known. It meant accepting that her act of freeing Hinto had cost her the life she had fought so hard to maintain alone for 3 years. Yet staying meant facing whatever consequences were approaching, and she had no illusions about her ability to defend herself against armed men convinced she had committed crimes against their interests. She was trapped between impossible choices, and the weight of that reality settled over her like the heavy snow that continued to blanket the valley. That night, as Abigail lay sleepless trying to decide her course of action, she heard sounds that sent terror through her chest, horses approaching in darkness, multiple riders moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of travelers seeking shelter. She extinguished her lamp quickly and moved to the window, peering through gaps in the shutters to see shadowy figures surrounding her property. There were at least 8 men, perhaps more, and their body language suggested hostility rather than friendly intention. They did not approach her door immediately, instead appearing to confer among themselves while studying her cabin and outbuildings. Abigail's mind raced frantically, trying to calculate options. She could not run. They had her surrounded, and she would not survive long in the frozen wilderness without proper supplies or knowledge of where to go. She could not fight. One young woman against numerous armed men had no chance of successful resistance. She could only face whatever they intended, and hope that innocence and truth might somehow protect her, though Reverend Thomas's warnings suggested such hope was probably futile. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and forced herself to remain calm, knowing that panic would serve no useful purpose, regardless of what was about to happen. The knock on her door, when it finally came, was neither polite nor tentative. It was the aggressive pounding of men who expected immediate compliance. Abigail opened the door slowly, holding her lamp high to illuminate her face and convey that she was alone and unarmed. The man who had knocked was tall and weathered, with cold eyes that assessed her with obvious suspicion. He identified himself as Captain Morrison, leader of a civilian militia formed to protect settlements from tribal hostilities and to ensure that no sympathizers aided enemies of civilized progress. His words were formal, but his tone carried barely contained aggression that made clear he had already decided she was guilty of whatever crimes he intended to accuse her of committing. Morrison demanded to know if she had encountered bounty hunters several days prior, and when she confirmed that she had provided them overnight shelter, his expression hardened further. He stated that those bounty hunters had reported a valuable Lakota prisoner, had escaped from their custody during the night they spent at her property, and that she was the only person who could have been responsible for that escape. Abigail maintained her composure as she denied any knowledge of the prisoner or his escape, explaining that she had slept in her cabin while the bounty hunters remained in her barn, that she had no involvement with their business beyond providing basic hospitality as frontier custom demanded. Her denials fell on deaf ears. Morrison was not interested in her explanations or protestations of innocence. He had apparently decided before arriving that she was guilty, and her words only seemed to confirm his prejudice that she was being deliberately deceptive. He informed her coldly that the militia had authority to deal with threats to settler safety, using whatever measures they deemed necessary, and that her isolated valley had become a liability that could no longer be tolerated. He gave her until dawn to gather whatever personal possessions she could carry, after which she would need to leave permanently. When she asked where she was supposed to go in the middle of winter, with no resources, Morrison responded with brutal indifference that her planning failures were not his. Concerned she should have considered consequences before aiding the enemy, the militia members remained surrounding her property through the night, apparently to ensure she did not flee with more possessions than they deemed appropriate or attempt to destroy evidence they believed existed. Abigail packed a single bag with clothing, her mother's Bible, a few precious photographs and what food she could fit, moving through her cabin in a state of numb shock. Everything else, furniture her father had built, dishes her mother had treasured 3 years of her own labor maintaining and improving the homestead, would have to be abandoned. As dawn approached and grey light began illuminating the snow-covered valley, Abigail stood in her doorway, taking one last look at the home she was being forced to leave, grief and anger warring within her chest. Morrison and his militia were waiting as the sun rose, their horses stamping impatiently in the cold morning air. The captain gestured curtly for Abigail to begin walking, making clear that they would not be providing transportation or any assistance beyond allowing her to leave with the possessions she had packed. As she stepped off her porch, bag in hand, one of the militia members called out a question to Morrison. What should they do with the property now that the sympathizer was being removed? Abigail felt ice form in her stomach as she heard Morrison's response: burn it. Burn it all to send a message that collaboration with hostiles would not be tolerated. Abigail spun around in horror, pleading desperately for them to reconsider. The cabin was worth nothing to them. Destroying it served no purpose beyond cruelty. If they wanted her gone, she was leaving. There was no need to burn everything her parents had built, everything that remained of her family's legacy. Morrison's expression remained unmoved by her appeals. He stated coldly that the homestead had become a known refuge for enemies, that allowing it to stand would invite others to use it for similar purposes, and that complete destruction was necessary to demonstrate the consequences of betraying settler interests. He ordered 2 of his men to begin the process immediately. The militia members moved efficiently, clearly experienced in such destruction. They entered her cabin and began dragging out furniture and possessions, piling them near the walls before one man produced a torch. Abigail watched in helpless anguish as they set fire to the pile, flames quickly catching and spreading to the cabin's wooden walls. Within minutes the structure was engulfed, thick smoke rising into the clear winter sky. The men moved systematically to her barn next, setting it ablaze as well, and then to her chicken coop and small shed where she stored tools. Everything was being destroyed methodically, reducing years of work and care to ash and ruin. The heat from the burning buildings created strange contrast with the frigid air, snow melting in expanding circles around each fire, while Abigail stood shivering in her coat, watching her entire life consumed. Some of the militia members seemed to take satisfaction in the destruction, laughing and making crude jokes about teaching lessons to those who aided savages. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing that they were destroying an innocent woman's home based on unproven suspicions, but none spoke up to question Morrison's orders or suggest any mercy. They were following their leader's direction, and in this moment of heightened fear and anger, compassion had no place in their calculations. As the last of her buildings collapsed into flame and ember, Morrison approached Abigail and informed her she needed to leave immediately. He pointed roughly toward the east, where the nearest settlement lay 2 days' hard travel away. She would need to walk there, as they were not obligated to provide her transportation. He warned her not to attempt returning to this valley or rebuilding, as the militia would be watching for any signs of renewed sympathizer activity. If she valued her life, she would relocate far from this region entirely, and never again involve herself in matters that did not concern her. His words were a threat barely disguised as advice, and Abigail understood clearly that her safety depended on absolute compliance. She began walking east as ordered, her legs feeling wooden and unreal beneath her, her mind unable to fully process the catastrophe that had just destroyed everything she possessed. Behind her the valley continued burning, smoke visible for miles in every direction, a signal to anyone watching that this was the price of perceived betrayal, that mercy shown to the wrong people could cost you everything. Abigail walked mechanically for hours, putting distance between herself and the ruins while her thoughts spiraled through shock, grief, and disbelief. She had released one wounded prisoner as an act of basic human compassion, and in response, armed men had burned her entire world to ashes. As afternoon approached, and exhaustion began competing with emotional devastation, Abigail finally stopped to rest beside the trail, collapsing onto a fallen log with her small bag of belongings clutched against her chest. For the first time since the militia had arrived, she allowed herself to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body and left her gasping for breath in the cold air. She cried for her lost home, for her parents' destroyed legacy, for the naive belief that doing right might actually matter in a world that seemed determined to punish kindness and reward cruelty. She cried until she had no tears left, until she sat hollow and empty, staring at the ground, wondering what possible future remained for someone who had lost absolutely everything. It was in that moment of complete despair that she heard a sound that made her head snap up in alarm. Movement in the trees nearby, footsteps approaching cautiously. Her first thought was that Morrison's militia had followed to deliver some final punishment, and she braced herself for whatever might come. But the figure that emerged from the winter forest was not one of the militia members. It was Hinto, the Lakota warrior she had freed days ago, now looking healthier and stronger despite the harsh conditions. He had somehow tracked her, had apparently been watching from a distance when the militia burned her valley, and had followed her afterward with purpose she could not yet understand. Hinto approached slowly, his hands visible and empty to show he meant no threat. When he was close enough to speak, he used halting English combined with gestures to convey his message. He had witnessed what happened to her home, understood that she had suffered terribly because of her choice to help him, and felt bound by honor to offer whatever assistance he could provide. He knew places where she could find shelter and survival through the winter, people who owed him favors and might help despite her being an outsider. He could not restore what she had lost, but he could perhaps prevent her from freezing or starving alone in the wilderness. Abigail stared at him, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness after hours of experiencing only cruelty. She had expected nothing from freeing him except the satisfaction of following her conscience, had never imagined he might return to help her, when doing so, put him at risk of recapture. She tried to speak but found her voice failing, choked by emotion and exhaustion. Hinto seemed to understand without words. He gestured for her to follow, indicating they needed to move before darkness fell and temperatures dropped further. After a moment of hesitation, Abigail stood and followed him into the forest, leaving behind the trail that led to settler towns and familiar territory, choosing instead to trust the warrior she had saved with her own uncertain future. Hinto led Abigail through terrain she never would have navigated alone, winding paths through dense forest, across frozen streams, where stepping stones remained visible beneath ice, up rocky slopes that seemed impassable until he showed her the hidden routes. He moved with confidence born of extensive knowledge, pausing occasionally to ensure she was keeping pace, despite her exhaustion and emotional trauma. As darkness approached, he brought them to a small cave concealed behind a stand of evergreens, its entrance barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the space was cramped but dry, and evidence of previous occupation, a ring of stones for fire. Stacked firewood suggested this was a known shelter used by travelers who understood its location. Hinto quickly built a small fire using materials already stored in the cave, creating warmth that made Abigail realize just how dangerously cold she had become during hours of exposure and walking. She collapsed near the fire, shivering violently as her body began responding to the heat. Hinto wrapped one of her blankets around her shoulders, then used materials from his own pack to prepare food, dried meat, and something that looked like compressed berries mixed with fat, which he offered to her with gentle insistence. Abigail ate mechanically, barely tasting anything, her mind still processing the destruction of her home and the surreal reality of now depending on a Lakota warrior for survival. As the fire burned and darkness fully settled outside, Hinto spoke quietly in his limited English, attempting to explain his situation and his intentions. He told her his name meant blue, like the sky, and that he had been traveling alone when the bounty hunters ambushed him weeks ago. They had kept him prisoner while trying to sell him to military authorities for bounty money, treating him brutally and denying him food or water for days. When Abigail freed him, she had saved not just his life but also his honor. Being captured was shameful enough, but dying as a prisoner without resistance was unthinkable. Her act had given him the chance to escape and return to his people with dignity, and that created a debt he was obligated to repay. Abigail listened quietly to his explanation, understanding beginning to form despite her exhaustion. In his culture, she gathered, debts of honor were serious matters that created lasting obligations between people. By saving his life, she had bound them together in ways that transcended their different backgrounds and the societal forces that insisted they must be enemies. Hinto felt responsible for the consequences she had suffered as a result of helping him, and his sense of honor demanded that he help her survive now that her own world had been destroyed. It was not pity or charity he offered, but rather fulfillment of duty as he understood it. She tried to express her gratitude through their limited shared language, explaining that she had expected nothing in return for freeing him, that she had simply been unable to witness suffering without attempting to prevent it. Hinto nodded understanding, but made clear that his response was not dependent on her expectations. What mattered was the reality of the debt and his obligation to honor it. He would help her reach safety, would teach her what she needed to know to survive in territories she did not understand, and would ensure she had options beyond freezing alone or returning to settlers who had proven they cared nothing for her well-being. Over the following days, Hinto guided Abigail deeper into wilderness territories, moving carefully to avoid both military patrols and areas where hostile encounters between different groups made travel dangerous. They stopped at hidden shelters similar to the first cave, places known to those who understood the land, but invisible to casual travelers. Hinto taught her essential survival skills: how to move quietly through forest, how to read signs in disturbed snow or broken branches, how to find food sources in winter landscape that appeared barren but held resources for those who knew where to look. Abigail proved an attentive student, understanding that her survival now depended on acquiring knowledge completely different from what she had learned managing a homestead, and they traveled, and her physical condition improved with regular food and adequate rest. Abigail's emotional state also began shifting from shock and grief towards something more complex. She found herself thinking deeply about what had happened, not just the immediate trauma of losing her home, but also the larger implications. The militia had destroyed everything she possessed based on suspicion and prejudice, demonstrating that the society she belonged to cared nothing for justice or truth when fear and anger took control. They had punished her for showing mercy, had treated compassion as a crime worthy of complete destruction. In contrast, Hinto, who came from people she had been taught to view as savage enemies, had returned to help her when he could easily have disappeared and never thought of her again. TRC. Contradiction forced Abigail to reconsider assumptions she had absorbed without conscious examination. She had been raised to believe that settlers represented civilization and progress, while tribal peoples represented obstacles to be removed or controlled. Yet her actual experience suggested something far more complicated. The civilized men had burned her home with casual cruelty, while the savage warrior was treating her with consideration and honor. Perhaps the categories she had been taught were false, or at least inadequate for understanding the complex realities of human behavior and character. Perhaps good and evil distributed themselves across all groups, and judging people based on their origins rather than their actions was fundamentally flawed. These thoughts occupied Abigail during the long hours of travel through frozen wilderness. She and Hinto continued building their shared vocabulary, combining English, Lakota, hand gesture to create communication adequate for practical needs and increasingly for deeper exchanges about their experiences and perspectives. She learned about his life, his family on reservation lands, his frustration with systems that treated his people like children needing control, his grief over the loss of traditional ways of living that had sustained his ancestors for generations. She shared her own story, her parents' deaths, her years of isolation, her act of freeing him and its devastating consequences. Their conversations created connection that transcended the obvious differences in their backgrounds. After 2 weeks of careful travel, Hinto brought them to a small settlement, not a reservation but rather an independent community of mixed heritage peoples who lived at the margins of both settler and tribal societies. It was a place where Abigail's presence would be unusual but not impossible, where she could potentially find temporary shelter and work while deciding what to do with her uncertain future. Hinto introduced her to several people in the community, explaining her situation and vouching for her character in ways that gave her credibility she would not have possessed arriving alone. The community's response was cautiously welcoming, offering her a place to stay in exchange for contributing labor to shared survival efforts. As Hinto prepared to depart after ensuring Abigail had been accepted into the community, she experienced complicated emotions: gratitude for his help, anxiety about managing alone again, and unexpected sadness at his leaving. He had become her guide through impossible circumstances, and his presence had created a kind of stability in a world that had been violently disrupted. She tried to express these feelings through their limited language, thanking him for saving her life, just as she had saved his, acknowledging the bond that had formed between them through shared hardship. Hinto listened carefully, then spoke words she would remember long afterward. He told her that sometimes the old boundaries between peoples needed to be crossed by individuals brave enough to recognize their shared humanity, and that her courage in freeing him had taught him that such crossing was possible. He left her with a small carved token, a blue stone he said represented both his name and his promise to remember her always. Spring arrived slowly in the Kansas borderlands, melting snow and revealing landscape transformed by winter's severity. Abigail had spent 4 months living in the mixed heritage community, working alongside people whose lives existed in the complicated spaces between the dominant categories of settler and tribal identities. She had learned new skills, different methods of preparing food, techniques for creating clothing from available materials, approaches to healing that combined knowledge from multiple cultural traditions. More importantly, she had learned that community could be built on principles other than shared ethnicity or background, that people could come together around mutual needs and values rather than requiring absolute cultural homogeneity. The work was difficult and resources remained scarce, but Abigail found satisfaction in contributing to something larger than individual survival. She helped with gardens being prepared for planting, assisted with caring for children while their parents worked on other tasks, and gradually earned respect within the community for her reliability and willingness to learn. Some members remained suspicious of her settler background, and she understood their wariness given the histories of broken treaties and violence that shaped their experiences. But others, particularly an elderly woman named Margaret, who had herself crossed cultural boundaries decades earlier, took interest in mentoring Abigail and helping her navigate the complex social dynamics of their unusual community. One warm afternoon in late April, a visitor arrived who brought news that both troubled and somehow relieved Abigail, Reverend Thomas, the traveling preacher, who had warned her months earlier about the gathering storm that eventually destroyed her valley. He had somehow learned of her survival and location and had traveled specifically to inform her of developments in the region. The militia that burned her home had continued their campaign of intimidation and violence, but their excesses had eventually drawn criticism, even from other settlers, who recognized that burning homes based on mere suspicion undermined everyone's security. Captain Morrison had been removed from leadership, and several militia members faced questions about their actions, though Abigail understood this represented political maneuvering rather than genuine justice. More significantly, Reverend Thomas told her that her valley lay abandoned, the burned ruins standing as testimony to what had occurred, but the land itself unclaimed by anyone. Under territorial law, she retained legal ownership despite having been forced to leave, and nothing prevented her from returning if she chose to rebuild. The preacher clearly expected this news would please her, offering as it did the possibility of reclaiming her lost home and restoring her previous life. But as Abigail listened to his well-intentioned explanation, she realized with clarity that surprised her. She did not want to return. The valley represented her past, her parents' dreams, a life that had been built on assumptions she no longer fully accepted. The destruction had been terrible, but it had also freed her from feeling obligated to maintain something simply because it was familiar. She thanked Reverend Thomas for the information and for his concern about her well-being, but she told him honestly that she was building a new life here in the mixed community, that she had found purpose and belonging in ways she never experienced during her years alone in the valley. The preacher seemed puzzled by her response, perhaps unable to understand why she would choose to live among people he likely viewed as existing outside proper civilization. But Abigail no longer needed his understanding or approval. She had learned through harsh experience that the society he represented was capable of great cruelty when fear and prejudice took control, and that character and compassion were not determined by which group someone belonged to, but rather by their individual choices and actions. After the preacher departed, Abigail spent time reflecting on how completely her perspective had transformed since that winter night, when she freed Hinto from the bounty hunter's wagon. At the time, she had acted on simple impulse and conscience, unable to witness suffering without attempting to prevent it. She had expected her act might bring consequences, but she never imagined those consequences would include losing everything and being forced into a completely different life. Yet here she was months later, and despite the trauma and loss, she felt more genuinely herself than she had during all those years of isolated survival in her parents' valley. She thought about Hinto occasionally, wondering where he was and whether he had successfully reached his people. The blue stone he had given her remained in her pocket, a reminder of the connection they had formed and of his honor in returning to help her when she became a refugee from her own society. She hoped he was safe, hoped he remembered her as she remembered him, hoped that somehow their brief intersection had meant something beyond immediate survival. The bond they had created seemed to represent possibility, proof that understanding could exist across even the most deeply entrenched divisions if individuals were brave enough to recognize each other's humanity. Summer arrived and Abigail participated fully in the community's seasonal work, planting crops, repairing structures, preparing for the cycle of harvest and preservation that would sustain them through the next winter. She was no longer an outsider being provisionally tolerated, but rather a member contributing her labor and receiving her share of whatever the collective efforts produced. The arrangement was different from owning property individually, but Abigail found she preferred it. Individual ownership had made her isolated and vulnerable, while community membership created networks of support and mutual obligation that felt more sustainable and humane. One evening, as she sat with Margaret watching children play while adults prepared the evening meal, the elderly woman spoke thoughtfully about Abigail's journey. Margaret observed that some people spent their entire lives within the boundaries they were born into, never questioning or examining the assumptions that shaped their understanding of the world. Others, through circumstance or choice, or often some combination of both, were forced to cross those boundaries and discover that reality was far more complex than the simple categories they had been taught. Margaret said she recognized Abigail as one of these boundary crossers, someone whose compassion had pulled her out of comfortable certainty and into difficult truth. Abigail considered Margaret's words, recognizing their accuracy. She had crossed boundaries she never intended to approach, from settler to refugee, from isolated to community member, from unquestioning acceptance of societal divisions to critical examination of them. The crossing had cost her everything she possessed materially, but it had given her something perhaps more valuable, understanding that humanity existed in all its complexity across all groups, that mercy and cruelty distributed themselves without regard to ethnicity or culture, and that building a meaningful life required choosing principles over prejudice, even when such choices carried terrible costs. As darkness settled and the community gathered for their shared meal, Abigail felt something she had not experienced since her parents died, a sense of belonging that was genuine rather than simply accepted because no alternatives existed. She had been burned out of her valley by men who claimed to represent civilization and justice, but she had been welcomed into community by people those same men would dismiss as less than fully human. The irony was not lost on her, but neither was the lesson it taught about where actual humanity resided and how one recognized it when systems of power and prejudice made such recognition difficult. She thought of the smoke that had risen from her burning valley months earlier, visible for miles as a warning to anyone who might consider showing mercy to the wrong people. But fire that destroys also clears ground for new growth, and from the ashes of her previous life, Abigail had built something different and perhaps more honest. She had released a captive warrior in silence, and riders had burned her valley in response. But their cruelty had not destroyed her capacity for compassion or her determination to live according to conscience. If anything, their actions had strengthened her conviction that mercy mattered most precisely when it was most difficult and most costly. That conviction would guide her forward into whatever future awaited, and she faced that future not with fear, but with hard-won clarity about what truly mattered in a world too often governed by those who mistook power for righteousness.